Welcome to this bite-sized session for the T-Level Accounting Getting Ready to Assess the Core Papers. This session will focus on assessment objectives. In this session, we're going to focus on the assessment objectives. These can be found on page 54 of the specification. As you can see on this page, this is the table from page 54 of the specification, and this details the different objective outcomes as well as the percentage of marks that are available on each paper for each assessment objective. So there are 3 assessment objectives, but as you can see, assessment objective 1 and 3 are split into 2. So there are 5 assessment objectives that students might be assessed on in their core exams. So we start out with assessment objective 1A, which is looking at knowledge. So these are those very first questions in each section of the paper where students are recalling knowledge. It might be knowledge in isolation. They might be asked to name, state, identify. So on paper 1, there are 7 marks available for knowledge. And on paper 2, there are 8 marks available. So as you can see, it's around the 7 to 8% of marks will be for just recalling knowledge. Then moving on to assessment objective 1B, this is where they move into understanding. So it moves away from sort of the identify, state, give, and starts moving into maybe the describe or explain territory. So there are 14 marks on paper 1 available for this and 16 marks available on paper 2. So you can see this is like 15 to sort of 18% of the marks available. So it is quite a number of marks. These tend to be questions where it's maybe those 2, 3, 4 mark questions, or it might be where it's a context question and students are pulling knowledge out of the context and then they're answering it. So they might be explaining something based on a scenario. Moving that swiftly into assessment outcome 2, which is application. Those are the context marks. So throughout paper 1, there are 39 marks available for context. 36 on paper 2, so that's like 40 to 43% of the marks available. So it's important that students understand that those context marks, that giving answers that are relevant to the scenarios and reading those scenarios and not just answering sort of anything that could be there, they've got to be able to use specific knowledge. That's what they're looking for there. So it's worth a lot of marks. So it's really important that you focus when you're preparing students for assessment on those context skills. Can they read the scenarios or the stimulus material? Do they know what they're looking to pull out? Do they then know what the question is asking them to then do with that knowledge? And can they then follow that final step through? Moving then on to assessment outcome 3. So these are those higher level thinking skills. These are likely to be more in those longer extents or extended open response questions towards the end, the 6, 9, 12 markers. So for assessment objective 3A, this is going to be analysis. So we're looking for the students to consider the pros and cons or give factors or issues or impacts. So on paper 1, there are 18 marks available and the same for paper 2. So 20% of the paper marks will be for students demonstrating that they can analyse the information they've been given. Now, these questions will come with stimulus material, the case studies. So they will be looking to get the analyse and the application marks together. So it's important that they can read the case study, look at it, understand what the question is asking them for, and then give that sort of both sides, or maybe they're considering impacts of the question. And finally then we've got assessment objective 3B, which is evaluate. These are the 12 mark questions on each paper. As you can see, there's 12 marks available, so they are in those big extended open response questions, so just in the 12 markers, and that's worth 13% of the marks on each paper. So these questions will have asked students, again, it's got the stimulus material, it's got the case studies, it will have asked them to read the stimulus material, it will have asked them to have analysed or considered impacts or whatever they were doing, and then it's going to ask them to make judgments based on all of the information that they've got available. So it's really important that when students are looking at the papers, or even if they're looking at sort of the employer set project and they're seeing these sorts of command verbs, that they understand what it is that they need to do, because as you can see, there's quite a lot of marks that are for context, analysis and evaluation. There's less marks available maybe for sort of just knowledge and understanding, so you can see how it's so important that learners perfect those skills and really consider what the assessment objectives are for each question that they're tackling. So there are very specific command words that will appear within the core papers. On pages 123, you can find the command words for the core papers, and on page 124, you can find the command words that might be used in the employer set project and the occupational specialism. There are some differences, so it's important that when you're preparing students for any of their assessments, that you do look at the command words that are going to be used. And that students are familiar with these. Now, there is a bite-sized video fairly similar to this on command verbs that they can go and watch on YouTube. The link is there. You're free to share that with them and to use that in teaching. But these are the ones specifically that will appear on the core papers. So with those AO1s there, you can see we've got give and name. So they might be being asked to recall a piece or pieces of information. So if it's a 2-mark question, it might be give 2 sources of finance, for example, and they could put those down there. So it's sort of a knowledge in isolation, sort of simple recall type questions. We've also then got explain questions. So this will be where the student's going to identify something and then they're going to give a justification for it. Now, there are 2-mark explains, there are 3-mark explains on the paper, so it's important that where you're preparing students for assessment, that they really look at how many marks there are on the question. So if it's a 2-marker, it would be a point and development. If it's a 4-marker, obviously it's going to be 2 points with 2 developments. But if it's a 3-marker, it's going to be that point, that development, and then that further development. And if students aren't paying attention, they just think, oh, explains always a 2, they're throwing away a sort of a mark there because they're not really understanding what's being looked for. So it's something that's really important to pay attention to with the command words in the exam papers. Is this a 2? Is this a 3? And what do they need to be providing? As we move up then, we start moving away from these sort of the shorter questions, so maybe the medium response, and we start moving into the 6, the 9 and the 12 markers. So you might see discuss in the 6 and 9 markers, and that's where students are going to be asked to consider the factors. So that's where they're going to get their case study or some stimulus material there, and then they're going to need to answer the question in the context of that. And it's likely that they might have to give careful consideration to opposing aspects of a situation or an issue or a problem or something that the business or organisation is thinking of doing. And again, they might get an assess. So again, they're going to consider those factors in relation to that case study. And then they're going to give the same sort of consideration, but they might lead into a judgment. So this is more likely to appear either as the 9 or the 12-mark question. And then obviously evaluate is only going to appear sort of on the 12-mark because that does require that really reasoned judgment. So they are going to have to consider the factors, they're going to have to consider sort of characteristics, and then they're going to have to make that reasoned judgment as well. So it's a very easy sort of pattern for students to identify within the papers. If I see this command word, I know I've got to do this. Now, one of the big things we have found before I move on to calculate with students is they are running out of time. Now, 2.5 hours for 90 marks might seem quite fair, but by the time they've read the scenario or looked through the paper, they've got familiar, they've got settled, we're finding that they're regularly running out of time with maybe the extended open responses. So it's worth, when you're looking at command words, looking at exam strategy as well. What's the best way for those students to get familiar with how long, say, an evaluate question might take? Are they going to do an essay plan? Are they going to go straight into it? Is it maybe worth them starting at the end of the papers doing those big markers and working backwards, because it might be quicker for them to go through the sort of the explain and the given name questions? Is it that they're going to hit some easy wins on the way through to settle in, and then they're going to go to the end and come back? Or is it that they like to do it in order from one to the end? Um, in which case, it might be that you need to look at giving them the time management skills that they're going to need for that. So it's really important when you're looking not only at command words in terms of what they've got to do, that you also talk to them about the time commitment that each question might need. Given name, they do not need to write massive sentences. It might just be as simple as a 1 or 2 word answer. Whereas for evaluate, you're not going to want them to be doing it in bullet points. It's going to need to be in sort of full sentences and paragraphs. Equally, you might find there are going to be some calculate questions on the papers. So for a calculate question, what they're looking for them is to obtain a numerical answer. There'll be marks for the right answer, but we're also going to want to see the working out. So that might be that they can recall the formula that they've used and that they show the working, because if they've put the right working down and something's gone wrong as they've popped it in the calculator, or they've miswritten it down, they sort of transposed the numbers, if we can see the working there, then they're at least going to get some of the marks rather than losing all the marks if they only put the final answer. Okay, so they are the command words that will appear on the core papers. So as you can see from this slide, we've looked at the assessment objectives, we've looked at the command words, and you can see here there's a nice sort of diagram that sort of details which command words will go with each. So as you can see here, as we discussed on the last slide, name and give are going to go with those 1A. Simple questions, start the paper, help students settle in, display their knowledge. And then as we start moving through the paper or through each section, you're going to get slightly harder. So we'll ask them to explain, where they give us some knowledge and then they expand on it. As we then start moving away from those sort of short and medium response questions and into the longer extended open response questions, for 3A, they will be looking at discuss. And then obviously for those really long questions at the end, but particularly that 12 marker, they might be asked to assess or evaluate because they need that conclusion. They need to make those judgments there. There are no command verbs that are associated with the context. So it's just a case of if students see that there is a scenario or a case study or some sort of stimulus material over and above the question, then they can safely assume that there are likely to be AO2 marks that are available for them. So this might be nice for you to maybe give them, or they can use, if you use the sort of displays on the wall, or if you're using learning maps or any of those sorts of techniques, because it's something quick and easy that they can sort of relate back to. So when they're learning how to do the papers, they go, okay, it's an AO1, I'm going to use this. So on the screen, you can see an example of a question that came from the sample assessment materials, the SAMs, for accounting paper 1. This is an example of a question where it's going to be an AO1B explain, and it's also going to have AO2 marks available because there is a scenario. So students will review the scenario, and then what they will do is, having read the scenario, they will then answer the question. So this one is explain one impact on the value of the computer hardware as reported in the statement of financial position after 1 year if LTAS uses the straight line depreciation method. So as you can see here, this is quite a long question, and they've obviously read a lot of information. So that goes back again to that time management, so that when you look at it and you think, actually, that's quite a nice amount of time, there's a lot of reading there for a 2 marker initially, but obviously it feeds into other questions later. So it's again preparing those learners for how much time do I spend, and equally, how do they break down this question? So what are they being asked to do? So we can see it's a 2 marker. We can see they need 1 impact. So they know from that that it's 1 impact with 1 reason why that is a result of the straight line depreciation method being used. So it's about teaching them to sort of ignore maybe the noise in the question, so they can focus in on what it is they're being asked to do, and they can extract that out of that case study in a reasonable amount of time, so that they're able to make good progress through the paper. On this slide, this is the mark scheme for the question we were just looking at. So this is points-based marking. So it's a case of you get 1 mark for the correct impact and then 1 mark for a correct development. So this would be nice if you're teaching sort of students how to approach the papers. You can share this with them, they can have a look at it, but it obviously also makes it useful for them to look at it and say, okay, what are they looking for? What do I need to include in here? And it also can help if you were giving this alongside maybe the scenario and the question when you're teaching students how to do the questions, that they can see if they can go back and identify where this information has come from. So what have they had to use from the scenario to get this? So almost like a be the examiner type activity, so that they know what they need to be extracting so that they can then write these good quality responses. This is a good example of an activity that you could do with students when you're doing this sort of task. So things like, can you spot the requirement for application? So are they able to see if this is a question that requires application or not? You could give them a range of questions, and they've got to pick out the ones that do need context, the ones that don't. You could have a look at how are the marks allocated. So you could use the lead examiner reports to give them examples, or if you've had students who've taken the papers in the past and they've agreed for you to get their past papers, and you've anonymised them, then you could maybe share some past answers with them. You could even get students to answer the questions and swap them in class, and then look at where they would allocate the marks based on the mark scheme and the scenario. And you could look at how could they prepare it, so they could actually write a structure. You could develop a structure with them on, okay, what steps do we need to do? What do we need to include? And it can be done for any of the scenario questions or even the non-scenario questions. What do we need to do? How can we do it? You can use any of the sort of acronyms that you might be using. English sort of use PIL. There's sort of AGIM. There's all sorts of acronyms that you could use if you wanted to. But it's just getting students used to that process of, okay, I can see it's got this many marks. I can see this is the command verb. I can see, does it have a scenario or not? Therefore, I know I've got to do these things, because obviously they know what assessment objectives are being targeted. They know what the command verbs are, and then they can go away and they can tackle that. Thank you for listening to this bite-sized session for the T-Level in Accounting on assessment objectives. We hope it's been useful.